The International Space Station ISS has orbited Earth for over 2 decades now, making possible scientific discoveries that wouldn't have been possible without this lab in the sky with an international crew of astronauts on board. However, as all good things, its retirement date has been decided. NASA announced that the spacecraft will cease operations in 2031 and plunge into the South Pacific Ocean. But what is the ISS? Why is it being retired? How will it be retired? And what will take its place? This video says it all, so stay tuned to find out. So, what is the ISS? The International Space Station was the brainchild of former U.S. President Ronald Reagan, who in 1984 proposed building a permanently inhabited spacecraft in cooperation with a few other countries. In 1998, the first piece of the space station, a control module, was launched into space on board a Russian rocket. About 2 weeks later, a crew on board the U.S. Endeavour space shuttle attached the control module with another part, the Unity node. Over the next 2 years, the space station was built piece by piece until it was ready to carry a crew on board. It was on November 2, 2000 that the first crew arrived. In the last more than 20 years, there have been over 200 astronauts and cosmonauts from 19 different countries on board the space station at different points of time. In NASA's words, the International Space Station is a unique laboratory that is returning enormous scientific, educational, and technological developments to benefit people on Earth and is enabling our ability to travel into deep space. To give it a more perceptible definition, the ISS is an artificial satellite in low Earth orbit where astronauts can stay for months and conduct scientific research. The ISS is an international collaborative project that involves NASA, the USA, Roscosmos, Russia, JAXA, Japan, ESA, Europe, and CSA, Canada. The ISS serves as a microgravity and space environment laboratory for research in many fields, including astrobiology, astronomy, meteorology, and physics. According to NASA, the space station weighs about 1 million pounds on Earth and is approximately the same size as an American football field. It can support a crew of 6 people, along with visitors. It also houses laboratory modules from the United States, Russia, Japan, and Europe. Several landmark firsts were recorded on board the ISS in the last 2 decades. For instance, in 2018, NASA's Cold Atom Lab became the first facility to produce the 5th state of matter, called a Bose-Einstein condensate, in space. In 2016, a NASA astronaut was able to sequence DNA in space for the first time. Advanced water filtration and purification systems and successful attempts at crop production on board the space station have also offered useful lessons for people around the world who lack access to these crucial resources. Why is the ISS being retired? The space station's international focus has been a wonderful thing in many ways, says Duncan Steele, a space scientist at Shera Earth Observation Institute in New Zealand. The first segment of the space station, the Zarya control module, launched aboard a Russian Proton rocket from Baikonur Cosmodrome, Kazakhstan in 1998. Tons of parts have been added, removed, and replaced over the years since. But, Dr. Steele says, it was never the idea that the space station would be permanent. This is partly true because, quite simply, it's gunking up and wearing out. It's not just humans living on board. Bacteria, fungi, and other microbes survive and thrive there too. Imagine living in a caravan and you couldn't open the windows, but you have to keep it clean, Dr. Steele says. There's colonies of bacteria inside the space station which we don't necessarily see, but you could expect to cause all sorts of problems. When there's so much recycled air, it can get into the electronics, and so on. The outer surfaces are becoming worn, too. The space station orbits about 400 kilometers above Earth's surface. Any objects below about 500 kilometers naturally fall back to Earth, so the space station is regularly boosted to counter this effect. This means there's not too much in the way of space junk in the space station's path. It's not completely clear, though. But what is plentiful at 400 kilometers up is oxygen atoms. They comprise about 96% of the atmosphere in low Earth orbit. Oxygen atoms are very strongly oxidizing, and the space station is flying at around 7.8 kilometers per second through this very tenuous atmosphere of oxygen atoms, Dr. Steele said. Docking and undocking vehicles ferrying supplies and people to and fro can strain the space station's structure over the years. The constant maintenance and upkeep needed to keep the station in working order and support inhabitants is expensive, so doing away with the space station will save plenty of cash. For instance, NASA estimates savings to be approximately $1.3 billion in 2031, ramping up to $1.8 billion by 2033, which is money that could be put towards efforts to explore further and faster into deep space. How will the ISS retire? NASA has presented the ISS Transition Report, which consists of its plans for the space station in the coming decade, including its retirement. According to NASA's budget estimates, the ISS re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere will occur in January 2031. The ISS mission control will start by lowering its altitude, which will result in higher velocity overall. The spacecraft would be maneuvered to line up to its final target on the ground, the South Pacific Oceanic Uninhabited Area, SPOUA, in an area known as Point Nemo. The ISS operators will perform the ISS re-entry burn, providing the final push to lower ISS as much as possible and ensure safe atmospheric entry, the transition plan explains. Point Nemo has become a source of space cemetery, where decommissioned space debris is often brought to rest. Located about 2,700 kilometers away from any land, it is named after a character in Jules Verne's novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Interestingly, the ISS was meant to be operated only for about 15 years. In 2014, NASA extended its tenure in space by another 10 years. What will take its place? The International Space Station is the only fully operational and habitable space station up there at the moment, but it wasn't the first, and it certainly won't be the last. Dwellers of the spacecraft cemetery include remnants of the old U.S. space station Skylab, plus a handful of Soviet space stations that were launched in the 1970s and 80s, including the world's first modular space station, Mir, Russia, which was built and operated one side of the International Space Station, plans to develop and deploy its own enterprise, the Russian Orbital Service Station, in 5 or 6 years. According to Russian news agency TASS, NASA and Roscosmos are still discussing International Space Station operations until 2030 and whether Russia will still be involved. A space station already under construction is the Chinese Tiangong, the first part of which launched in April last year. It's the third Chinese space station. The nation launched Tiangong-1 and Tiangong-2 in 2011 and 2016, respectively. But this latest iteration is the first to have a modular design. China has never been a part of the International Space Station. In 2011, U.S. politicians passed the Wolf Amendment, which barred cooperation between NASA and Chinese organizations, citing human rights and national security concerns. But other agencies, such as the European Space Agency, have worked with China and continue to do so. So what about NASA? It will be replaced with 3 free-flying space stations to continue the work after ISS's retirement, NASA said. With its sights set further afield to deep space, the U.S. Space Agency is funding commercial partners and outsourcing its low Earth orbit activities to companies. The agency has entered into commercial agreements with 3 companies to develop the stations: Blue Origin, Nanocracks LLC, and Northrop Grumman Systems Corporation. Moreover, it's already permitted Axiom Space to attach modules to the space station, which will eventually detach to become their low Earth orbit facility. Enrico Palermo, head of the Australian Space Agency, says this new suite of space stations, particularly those from commercial operators, presents a terrific opportunity for the Australian space sector. Our industry will have a range of choices to suit their needs and fast-track their access to space, which will ensure our research and development opportunities are maximized, Palermo added. Phil McAllister, director of commercial space at NASA headquarters, said, "The private sector is technically and financially capable of developing and operating commercial low Earth orbit destinations with NASA's assistance. This transition to renting space onboard commercial platforms could end up saving NASA $1.3 million in 2031 alone," the space agency says. The money saved can be applied to NASA's deep space exploration initiatives, allowing the agency to explore further and faster into deep space. But NASA has laid down some ambitious goals for the next decade before the ISS is finally laid to rest. This includes using the spacecraft as an analog for a Mars transit mission.